Today's guest is Barbara Galiza. Barbara is a growth strategist and a former YC founder known for her expertise in data-driven decision-making and analytics, having worked with top tech firms like Microsoft and WeTransfer, as well as leading marketing agencies. Here are 3 things that I learned from Barbara. How important it is for you to maintain a good campaign taxonomy in your ad platforms. We talked about all the ML-based optimization that's happening on ad platforms. And finally, the growing awareness of the gaps in attribution. So let's get into it. Barbara, welcome to The Marketing Scientist. This is going to be really fun. I'm looking forward to the next 20, 25 minutes of conversation. The first thing that I will start with you is a fun question. So tell me, and I remember seeing this on your LinkedIn, but tell me about the biggest mistakes or errors that you've seen in a client's ad account. I know you talked about it a little bit in the past, but tell me what's been the most interesting or fun one that you've come across.
Yeah, so I think I've seen all different types of errors. I think the most common ones is, maybe the campaign, you think it's set to run in the UK and that's what the naming convention says, but then you look at the market and it's running, somewhere else entirely. I've seen retargeting campaigns being run without exclusions. So you're going okay, I want to, retarget people that dropped off, but then you don't exclude people that have converted. I thought of this other example, and that's for a bigger advertiser, which I will not name. But the campaign taxonomy that they had was set up in a place where conversions were being attributed to the wrong product. So think you're something like Google, and then you're running ads for YouTube subscriptions. And then you realize the YouTube subscriptions are actually being attributed to a G Suite ad.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's massive. Yeah, that's pretty big. So wait, tell me, so you've been doing this for, a few years now where you help large brands, both on the B2C and the B2B side, set up their, growth marketing, paid acquisition sort of infrastructure. And, that's why sort of these examples are so useful for people to avoid. And you mentioned this thing about taxonomy, and I'm going to start there because I think it's exactly the issue that we see with a lot of our customers is people just kind of start and they do a bunch of stuff, and lo and behold, they're successful. Now it's 2 years later, they've hired a team, there's a new team, and nobody knows what's happening in their ad account because there's no documentation, there's no taxonomy that's easy to consume. So if you had to recommend what every startup or business should do with taxonomy, what are 3 or 4 tips that you would give them to make sure they're future-proofing their ad accounts and their paid acquisition?
Yeah, that's a great question, Pranav. I think there's 2 main things that attribution impact. And I would say, that's how the budget is being allocated and how reporting is being segmented. So that's usually why, for, really big companies, they will have market in an advertiser level of something of those sorts, because usually, these big companies are allocating budget per market. So I would try to think, how are you allocating your budget? And then that should be the highest level that goes above. And I think a bit below will come, how do you want to report it? So the taxonomy should be supporting however you need to segment the results. So if you're testing different messaging, then you need to make sure that, your creative naming convention has that put in. If you want to segment per audience, that's also something you need to put in a level that you can report on. I always start with taxonomy for paid campaigns. I think that's often something that's overlooked. But if you can't align on, you need to first align on what does it matter when you're looking at the results. What do you need to report based on? And then that will trigger the taxonomy conversation. I had a client like before, also like a big advertiser in the food space, that we were talking about setting up their, campaign manager in the ad server. And we had weeks conversations if on the advertiser it should be market or it should be product, because they wanted to report on unique reach per market, and then it was only available on a certain level. So these things can really impact how you're able to attribute and report conversions.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it becomes so much harder when you already have 2 years of history and you're trying to come in and make sense of that data. And you're like, well, I can't tell you because you never actually cleaned your taxonomy when you started. And so it's a jumble. And do you really have the bandwidth and the patience to sit down and re-tag everything to then be able to go and clean things up and get you a baseline level of reporting, right?
A lot of the times you can't clean up, because if you wanted to report on audiences, but then you had one ad set running multiple audiences, and that data is gone, and there isn't anything you can do about it.
Exactly. So setting up a great foundation makes so much sense to get started. Okay. So on that note, one of the conversations you and I have had on LinkedIn and other places is, what is the deal with Google Analytics? Okay. So some people love it. Some people hate it. Some people are like, why would you ever use GA? And, there's a lot of like confusion about Google Analytics, in my opinion. What is your take on, how should you do website analytics? Is Google Analytics a recommended tool? Do you recommend Amplitude? Do you recommend something else? What is the tool of choice from your perspective?
Yeah, I think in the end, maybe that's not the best answer, but I don't think it matters that much which tool you use. I think in the end, what really matters is, how have you set up your events? How have you set up your attribution? And can you, slice and segment the data? I think there's a lot of hate on GA4 right now because of the UI. A lot of people find it, confusing. But UA was also super confusing and counterintuitive. We just got used to it because we used it for, I don't know, 20 years. I think, Amplitude and Mixpanel, those companies have also really changed their pricing models over the years. So now it's a lot cheaper to also use Mixpanel or Amplitude to track up like your website pages. Like before, how it used to be is your marketing pages, which is events that fire lots and have a lot of traffic, will be set up with Google Analytics, and then everything like post sign up within product will be Mixpanel and Amplitude, for example. I used to work for the startup, which was a B2C app called Her. And for us at the time, and it was 10 years ago, it was cheaper for us to stop using Mixpanel and hire someone who was a data scientist with a PhD from an Ivy League to work full time to crunch the data than to just pay for Mixpanel. And I was looking at it like before this call, and now you can get like 20 million events on Mixpanel for free. So I don't think like right now it doesn't make that much difference. I think what I really like about GA4 is how it made the BigQuery product more accessible. And you can have more control over your attribution model and cohort creations and all of that. But then you still need to have some data skill sets in-house. But I think, yeah, in the end, it's less about what tooling or more about what you're tracking, how you're modeling, how you're segmenting, and always trying to move away a bit from, these black box algorithms is what I suggest.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very valid point, and something that we've noticed recently, and we've recommended a couple of customers to do this, is Google Analytics is free, and you can now export all of your GA4 data, the raw data, right? It's not even sampled. All raw data can be exported to BigQuery, and you can take it to Snowflake, you can take it to Redshift, you can take it to wherever you want, and you can feed that back into your CRM through reverse ETL. You can do all of those things which were not possible in UA, and I think most people don't know that just yet. They're still thinking about, oh, you only get sampled reporting from GA. Like, that's not true. You can actually export everything.
Yeah, so yeah, before there was only a feature for, the GA360, which would be, contracts of like six figures a year. So I mean, I think it's all part of Google's strategy, like GA is free, but then you have to pay for, the storage and the computing of the data. I also think it's also why there's some missing functionality still missing on GA4. I was doing an analysis for a client like this week, and I was surprised to find out that in the UI, I can't segment per conversion. I can only see like conversions. I have to then use like event filtering for that. So I think there's a lot of these UI features that people were used to, and now they're missing from the J4. But I think regardless, I think BigQuery is a fantastic product. I would recommend to clients using J360 back then just because of the BigQuery integration. So I think it's good that now it's easy and they're investing more. They have the Facebook data transfer from BigQuery too. So there's other features moving towards making, this queryable marketing data more accessible.
No, that's a really good segue into our next sort of topic around, how people power all of their ad audiences, right? So you're already kind of alluding to getting the data into BigQuery and then using BigQuery to then power Meta. But then there's also, right, you've got the old school CDPs, you've got the new reverse ETL tools that are also kind of CDPs or composable CDPs, right? You've got all of your first party data that might be sitting in a BigQuery table or some other, Redshift or whatever, Snowflake. What do you think is the right way for, or is there a right way to then take all of that data and then feed that into every single ad tool to help with the targeting and the optimization? Like, what is your perspective on that whole space?
I think that's a good question. I think when it comes to audiences, there is no one size fits all. I've seen, performance campaigns with minimal targeting, for example, running certain markets, certain age range, perform really well. But in that case, it's usually companies that have strong data signals to share. So, what the goal of the campaign is, the events that it is firing a lot. So, it's giving the ad platform, enough signals to understand who is the customer they should be targeting. For some B2B signals, for some B2B companies, they have signals that occur less often if it's a leads campaign. And in that case, audiences can be a great way to reach the right people. I think perhaps there's not such a big need of refreshing audiences daily or weekly, because I know that's what a lot of the reverse ETLs, are selling. But I don't think there's an advantage of using a reverse ETL when it comes to workflow, when it comes to security. You don't want the agencies or whoever is managing your campaigns to be downloading these customer lists with a lot of PII, a lot of revenue information, and then re-upload to the ad platforms. So I think just controlling that alone is already a good benefit, although I question if the the refreshing is really that necessary.
That's a really interesting point. I liked how you described the difference between high frequency conversions and low frequency conversions and how that changes the need for targeting, right? Because what you're saying is, and tell me if I got this right, when you have lots of conversions happening or events being fired and collected in Meta or Google or any other ad platform, and you have broad targeting, then you're giving enough signal for Meta to say, well, even if there's broad targeting, the people who seem to be doing a lot of events are these type of people, and therefore I'm going to show more ads there. And the problem with trying to replicate that in a lower frequency sort of business is now you don't have that sort of feedback loop for Meta or Google. And that's where sort of narrowing targeting might be more efficient in terms of your costs. That is super helpful, and I think people will find that that resonates with their lived experience as well. Um,
No, I think you've put that perfectly. I think that's exactly it. You know, I always try to send as many data signals as possible to the ad platform. I think they can make like a really big difference. That's also why I recommend if you're a B2B company and it takes a while for your lead events to happen, be that book a sales call or book a demo, try to think if there's anything that's higher up the funnel that you can use as a way to understanding if you're reaching the right audience. And sometimes it can even be like a trigger event. Someone has spent 30 seconds going through the page, then you already have one signal to send to the ad platform that says, this person here is a bit closer to my target audience. So always try to find that to send to help the ad platform identify who the right user is.
I think that's such a valuable piece, and I hope everyone listening is paying attention to that, because to your point, in a high consideration product category, and B2B kind of clearly falls in that bucket, especially if it's a team purchase or a department-wide purchase, you can use leading indicators, and some people call them vanity metrics. I don't. I think you can use those leading indicators and feed that back into the ad platform. So that's great. Now, one related question with that: there's a huge movement both from Meta and Google and others around adding sort of an AI based or ML based ad creation and targeting engine, right? So on Meta it's called Advantage, and they have a few variations of it, and then on Google it's called PMax. I think Bing just released basically PMax for Bing. They just copied the name. And yep. And so I'm curious to hear your take. How much do you kind of leverage those out of the box ML driven capabilities for both designing and targeting, versus how much do you want to retain the control yourself to be able to say, here's exactly how we're going to create and then sort of distribute those ads?
Yeah, I always find that paid media is a balance, between getting the right results and understanding why you're getting those results. I think calling strategies like that ML capabilities is already like overselling it a bit. The way that I see, they're really black box strategies that make it very difficult for you to understand what's running and for you to control what's running. I've had, a big client that was spending a lot on Performance Max, run an incrementality test, and find out it was 30% incremental. So it was a very low number, and they had a very big percentage of the budget being allocated to that strategy. Also, recently I was working on some app campaigns on Google, which I hadn't worked in a while, and I was surprised to find they were even more black box than Performance Max. So I was setting up these app campaigns, and if I wanted to exclude certain keywords, I could only do it from an account level. So what we had to do was create multiple Google ad accounts, having each ad account with a different set of keyword exclusions, and then create an MCC on top of it to control the budget. I mean, an absolute, to me, like absurd setup that I can't say like, okay, for this campaign, exclude competitors. For this campaign, exclude brand terms. There was absolutely no control in that. I couldn't report to understand what keywords it was serving in. And obviously you can run incrementality tests and then understand, okay, how incremental is each of these strategies. But there's such a slow way of getting insights and to understand what's working and what you should double down on. I mean, I've heard Performance Max be really successful for e-commerce, but I've never run e-commerce ads. So I have to, take their word for it. But, for B2B, it's very difficult to understand and to scale.
It's a valid point, and I think it's still evolving. And I do, my take on this is that I think it's going to become more mainstream, just as it's reaching that, I would say adoption rate in e-commerce and consumer. I have to imagine that it's going to start picking up in B2B as well. But LinkedIn just added conversion API, for example, right? That happened like last year. And so I have to imagine that they're going to enable you to then do interesting things with that conversion API data to then do more advanced targeting on the B2B side. And, why wouldn't Facebook and Meta do the same for B2B? Okay, so this is really interesting. On that note, what I was curious about is how you recommend brands feed their data back into the ad platforms. Is it, implementing a bunch of pixels on their website? Is it conversion API? Is it, some other way of getting that data? What are you finding is the most easy and effective way to achieve that?
It's a great question. I've had very good experiences with CAPI. So, Facebook's, Meta's server-side tracking. I had a client of mine that, we were getting before CAPI something like 5 conversions from Meta a month. And then that went to something like 5,000 of ad platform attributed Meta conversions. We knew Meta was an important source for us because we were running econometrics studies. So we kept the spend on the platform, but we were never able to see the conversions in Meta. And I think, okay, you can question the incrementality of that, the duplication of conversions and all of that. But like I said before, it's valuable that Meta could now get the signals on who was converting. So that really, although we didn't look yet how that influenced, when looking at the overall ROAS from Meta, but I can only imagine have a positive impact when the platform can better identify who converts. For some B2B customers, what can also be good to set up is, offline conversions. Again, that would depend on the sales funnel, but I would say where you were previously, relying on pixels for app campaigns or for, big volume campaigns, I think the server side from TikTok, from Meta, I think that's a very worthwhile investment, and that will most likely improve your campaign.
Yeah, we feel the same way. And I think everyone's realizing that doing the client side, right, browser side type of tagging just causes a lot of data loss because of either cookies or consent or because of just cross-device stuff happening, right? You see an ad on mobile, but then you take the action on web and so on and so forth.
I feel like a lot of people don't realize that when you see an ad that is served within the Meta, the Facebook app, or within the Instagram app, and they go on to load and then open that, in the browser, in the in-app browser, they are different users. So even if the whole journey, they're different users, for the platform that's tracking this. So even if the whole journey occurs on mobile web, if it starts on in-app mobile web and it ends on, the proper browser mobile app, this journey won't be connected. So for Meta, where, I don't know the number exactly, but I would imagine, I don't know, something like maybe 80% is going to be mobile. And most people have the app installed and that's how they're seeing it. It really means that you are losing visibility of at least half the journeys.
That's a great point. I hadn't fully sort of internalized that point, but that makes a lot of sense. So the in-app browser is basically a completely separate session from their actual web browser session, and there's no way to connect the dots between those two. That is super insightful. I have one related question, Barbara. So let's say you set up, CAPI or conversion API across, Meta, TikTok, LinkedIn, and you have offline conversions on Google. Can you use those conversion events in your campaign goals? Or is it really just to see that, that you're feeding in all the conversion events for targeting? But for some reason, I feel like there's some confusion about whether you can actually use it for.
What do you mean by seeing it in the conversion goals?
So do you set goals for, bidding and, your daily budgets and all of those things? Can they rely on offline conversions and CAPI, or do they have to rely on just what you're getting from um, the, pixels or other type of tagging?
No, they can definitely rely. There's ways also that you can set up CAPI alongside the pixel, and you'll pass like a transaction ID, and then you're able to deduplicate. So you can fire the same event from different sources, and then use that as a goal and as reporting.
Right. So you do the connection as a brand that this user came to our website or mobile app, and you record that somehow in your first party data. Then you have that conversion event, and then you're sort of sending that hashed sort of ID back into the platform. So all of that setup requires a significant amount of time and effort, but it's well worth the investment. I completely agree with you. Okay, that was super helpful. Um, Okay, one last question before we wrap this up. So, we met recently, a few months ago, and you've been on this journey on sort of, advising people about marketing mix modeling, incrementality testing, in addition to using all of the analytics and, journey analytics, multi-touch attribution, whatever we want to call it. So, do you see the rate of adoption of these new methodologies sort of increase, or do you feel like it's going to be a long time before people fully adopt this idea of incrementality, whether through testing or whether through MMM?
It's a good question. I I don't really know. Anecdotally, I feel like people are more aware on the gaps of click-based attribution, even if those gaps haven't is they've changed a bit with these new technology and privacy changes. But a lot of the gaps were already there. But I think people are more aware of the gaps now, and I'm seeing more and more customers that have been, investing budgets in certain types of strategies based on the click attribution CAC. So, they've been, spending more on bottom of funnel, for example, and they're not seeing, an overall growth in revenue. They're taking a step back and they're trying to find out, okay, how do we better understand what's happening? And MMM is, I think, like almost like a one size fits all approach, and just very valuable. I would say, and I think we've talked about this before. There's also other ways of getting this overview, right? That go beyond click based. You can use vouchers. Vouchers are really powerful, but you can't use them for every strategy. You can use zero party data, asking like customers where they came from, and that's also really powerful too. But then you're also relying on, is the user aware? Did they really feel in that honestly and all of that? So, so I guess my answer is I feel like there's a growth in awareness on the gaps of click-based attribution, and MMM is positioned well to solve that need across different channels. So I see more and more people wanting to discover it. I do think these kind of decisions take time for marketing organizations. They usually will start with a pilot or maybe an ad hoc research from an agency. But I do think they're understanding that if they're looking at the right numbers, if they're looking at the wrong numbers, they're making the wrong decisions. And the wrong decisions are leading their growth to stagnate or even decrease.
Yep. Well said. All right. So on that note, we're going to bring it to a close. And I know that you are launching a course, or you already have launched a course on all things attribution and all the different methodologies. So how can people find that course? We'll put it in the show notes, but anything you want to talk about, what that course is meant to do and who it's meant for, and we'll wrap it up right after that.
Yes, yeah, great leeway into the course. So I'm doing the course with Timo Deschal, who is a friend, and he's an analytics engineer. So the goal of the course is to explain the different forms of attribution that exist, how they occur, understand how different sources give different numbers, and try to teach marketers how to make the best informed choice about what to set up and how to measure things. We still have to announce a date. Maybe by this time this podcast out, we have a date. But we're now open for pre-registering. It will be a free course. And if the course, and if the course is not out yet and you have attribution questions that you want to be answered in the course, feel free to share wherever Pranav is posting this podcast, and then we'll make sure to also include that. As a lead up, we've been organizing some office hours on my LinkedIn where we just go live and we take in attribution questions from people. So people can also connect to me on LinkedIn and then join those.
Fantastic. Awesome. Well, thank you, Barbara. This was fantastic. We'll put the link to the course pre-registration in the show notes. And I'm super excited. I might attend that course myself and learn a couple of things. So thank you again for coming on the podcast, and we'll see you again in a few months maybe and see how things are evolving in the space.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Pranav. Should I also say something on the newsletter that I have? Does that...
Go for it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so for marketers that are interested in learning more about data and how to really leverage measurement for making better decisions and understanding how your campaigns are performing, I write a blog. Well, I have a newsletter on this, and it's called the 021newsletter.com. So you can subscribe there and receive articles that are about attribution, audience building, testing roadmaps, and the likes.
Fantastic. All right. So everyone, reach out to Barbara on LinkedIn, through the newsletter, through the course, and we'll see you again in a few months, Barbara, and talk about how things are evolving. Well, there you go, folks. That was Barbara, a growth and marketing analytics consultant. We'll have many more fun and insightful conversations, so tune in again next week. See you then.